Okay, so good morning, everyone in Canberra. Good evening, Simone and Hélène and others in North America. So welcome everyone to the third in our series of 10th anniversary seminars. So these seminars celebrate part of the celebration of our 10th anniversary as a centre at the University of Canberra, although we existed for several years before that at Australian National University. Let me begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So the format of today's event, as I say, is that we have two excellent speakers in Hélène Landemore and Simone Chambers, who've both had lots to say about the role of mini-publics in deliberative democracy. Each of them will give a short opening statement, then I'll ask a question to each of them myself, and then we will throw things open for participants both online and in the room to ask questions. So if you're an online participant, it's probably best if you raise your virtual hand, and then you will be recognized. Okay. As I said, both Simone and Hélène have had lots to say about mini-publics in the past and their role in deliberative democracy. I think it's fair to say that comparing the two, Hélène is a relative enthusiast. Simone has sometimes been a relative skeptic. However, any disagreements they do have didn't stop Simone writing an endorsement of Hélène's open democracy. When I was checking that this morning, I noticed. Anyway, without further ado, let me hand over to Simone, who will give the first presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back in Canberra, although next time I hope it's in person. So the question that's on our agenda is, are mini-publics enough to promote deliberative democracy? And as John mentioned, some time ago, I was quite skeptical of mini-publics. So it's almost 15 years ago, I wrote an essay in which I was very worried about the focus on mini-publics. And I was worried that it was going to lead to a marginalization of deliberative democracy theory, and then it was just too narrow. And at the time, and I guess still today, I have a Habermasian perspective. So I have been interested in the broad public sphere and how we apply the deliberative democratic paradigm, if you will, or the approach to that messy public sphere open debate. And so what I saw happening was more and more interest in these small insulated institutions, and I really saw that as a withdrawal from mass democracy, and also a preoccupation with designing an institution that was insulated from other aspects of democracy and other influences. But that was a long time ago. So fast forward to today, and there's still, of course, a lot of interest in mini-publics, but it really has significantly changed. So even the people who are really interested in looking at the internal structure and nuts and bolts of mini-publics, they really have placed them in the context of a wider system. So now there's an acknowledgement that there is a vast, assortment and variety of mini-publics, and that the internal structure actually is determined by the function it plays in the larger system. And actually, I just want to do a little shout out to Nicole's pink book, Nicole et al., on mini-publics. It's really a fabulous book, which I have forced all my students to buy and read. That really looks at the structure. And what it really does is to show that all this variation can only be understood in connection to a larger system. So things have really changed. And I think it all has to do with this broader perspective in both in deliberative democracy, but actually I would also say in democratic theory in general, that is a more systemic approach and a real interest in not just the kind of ideal of an institution, but the way in which institutions fit into different kinds of contexts. So then in this fast forward world, what do I think of mini-publics? My criticism way back when, 2009, was very different from the contemporary criticisms. Actually, it was kind of the reverse. So the main contemporary criticisms of mini-publics right now, people like Christina Lafont and Nadia Urbanati, who are about to publish a book in which they do basically argue that taking sortition too seriously is really undemocratic. So this debate is all about the fears and dangers of empowering mini-publics, or particularly citizen assemblies, which are, you know, a subclass of mini-publics. So it's really the reverse. I was worried about the marginalization of that mini-publics were really not that important and not that central. And so to focus on these institutions was going to marginalize deliberative democracy. And now, really, because of the success and proliferation of this institution, the worry is exactly the opposite, that somehow mini-publics or citizen assemblies or sortition is going to replace elections. So the question is, how do I feel about that? So as I say, there really is a lot of worry. Even people who I think are big fans of mini-publics, so I would put John in that category. And I've recently read parts of John's new book in which he too is very cautious and a little bit skeptical about this notion of empowerment. So I actually am not worried about empowerment. As a matter of fact, I'm really excited about, for example, the possibility that citizen assemblies can become a second chamber in a bicameral system if the context is correct. I'm also very excited about the idea that you might use sortition to choose representatives in a mixed member, for example, legislative body. So and I also don't think that it's possible to have a really clear dividing line between empowerment and consultation, or empowerment and non-empowerment. And part of why I'm not worried is because, on the other hand, elections are not going to go away, nor do I think they ought to go away. I think that voting parties, electoral turnover play important functions in our democratic system. And I can see all sorts of ways in which citizen assemblies, particularly, but also mini-publics more generally, can play a role, including an empowered role. That is, a role which can, to some extent, push back and compete with the electoral part of the system. So I very much have a kind of, when it comes to democratic institutions, I have a toolbox approach. There's a toolbox with all sorts of institutions in them, all sorts of variation. And we need to think about using that toolbox in a way that doesn't just say, well, it's only, you know, citizen assemblies, or it's only elected legislatures, all sorts of ways of combining them. I mean, so one of the reasons why I think, I think I'm almost down my time, that I think the Irish case is so interesting and people are interested. It's not just, or even primarily, that there was a really successful citizen assembly used in the Irish constitutional case. It's that in Ireland, there was a intersection between parliament, referendums, and citizen assemblies. That is, it was a kind of intersection between, and really nice combination between different democratic institutions. So, and this is part of us, you know, looking at democracy as a system and looking at institutions as having functions and having different functions in different contexts. So, you know, in the end, I'm not going to answer the question of that really, you know, sometimes they're good and sometimes they enhance, and maybe not all the time they enhance. But I think we're really working in a world now where we really have a way more complicated, sophisticated, and nuanced and context-specific view of these institutions. So that's my 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Simone. So Hélène.
Yeah. So interesting to hear you, Simone, because you've become a little bit more enthusiastic, and I've become a little bit more skeptical myself, at least of the implementation and practice of these deliberative mini-publics. So the question I addressed was, do deliberative mini-publics mean abandoning mass democracy? For me, of course, it doesn't mean abandoning mass democracy. In my own work, Open Democracy, I actually defend mini-publics as complementary to participatory rights through which citizens can trigger popular votes, such as mass referenda or mass recall of laws that people deem unsatisfactory. So I see mass popular votes as well as social movements as critical aspects of a functional, legitimate, and authentic democracy. And I would never advocate moving to a pure lotocracy of sortition-based bodies whose member would rotate in power without ever involving the public as a whole. I think that's an interesting sort of philosophical construct, and I think Alex Guerrero, for example, does a fantastic job defending it. But that's not what I have in mind, and I want to keep mass and direct democracy in the mix. But more than that, even purely as a tactical matter, I think deliberative mini publics cannot, and their supporters cannot afford to abandon mass democracy, because we see what happens when they seek the support of established, only the support of established representative institutions and elected elites. 2024, this year, is the 20th anniversary of the first Citizens' Assembly, which took place in British Columbia, Canada, on electoral reform. So it's not the first mini public, but it's the first Citizens' Assembly as perhaps more political body of all the types of mini publics we're familiar with. It was the first, it was also the last in British Columbia, because politicians hated the concept. 20 years later, we see that as Citizens' Assemblies have multiplied, as Simone has remarked, they have also been largely co-opted. So in Ireland, we always celebrate Ireland as like the crown jewel of Citizens' Assembly, but it's been routinized to a point that David Farrell himself, one of the initiators of those mini publics there, deplores. And the net effect has been to re-legitimize political parties and elected elites, which on some level could be good. But it's also, as a result, allowed the latter, the politicians, to cherry pick the ideas they want to pursue and the referendum they want to organize. So if we look at the last, for example, so many of the ideas that came out of Irish Citizens' Assemblies have actually been ignored. And the last negative referendum in Ireland that just rejected the rewording in the constitution of the place of women in society, there are many ways to interpret what happened there, but it could suggest that this co-optation has gone too far and it's not working for the larger public. In France, if I look at the cases I've studied, the Climate Convention and later the Convention on End of Life, we have yet to have a referendum on the proposals that have come out of these assemblies. And the result is that the government was able to defang much of the proposals that came out of the first convention on climate. And so far, it's been able to refrain from acting on the recommendations of the last one on end of life. So I should slightly nuance that by saying that just last week, I've been invited, like all the former members of that convention or participants in as a member of the governance committee, to reconvene in France on April 26th. So in 2 weeks from now, the government is reconvening the convention on end of life to fully close the process by sort of organizing an accountability moment just after the law will be discussed in the Council of Ministers. But before it's discussed in Parliament or passed into actual law. So to me, that suggests that there's a little bit of co-optation going on there. They want to close the process and make sure nobody complains once the actual implementation takes place. I think mass democracy, and particularly a referendum on the introduction of a right to assisted suicide under conditions, would have made this kind of participation washing by the French government much less likely, or at least less easy. So again, tactically, I think you cannot separate mini publics from mass democracy. And I worry in general that we are at a critical point for many publics. Again, 20 years of more, 40 years if you include, deliberative polls and citizens' juries and all of that. So I should be more. It's been a while basically, but the deliberative wave maybe peaked in the last grew in the last 20 years. So those mini publics have grown in number and visibility, perhaps even legitimacy. I think it's documented that people know what they are and appreciate them and want to give them more of a say in the general process. But have they truly grown in power and influence? I am less sure about that. It's very hard to measure impact, and I think we, as researchers, we should perhaps spend more time on that, trying to evaluate exactly what's changed under the influence of mini publics. And it's telling to me that recently the world of capitalist firms has also turned to mini publics in search for some legitimacy. And that looks to me mostly like a PR move. So if you look at Meta, for example, of all corporations, it has recently conducted deliberative surveys of their user base on climate content, regulation of cyberbullying in the metaverse, and even AI regulation. And I think there are very good people at Meta who are, sincere and convinced that this is the right thing to do, and they want something that's a little bit more democratic and inclusive than their oversight board on free speech regulation. And I think at one point there was indeed an ambition to do something big. Jim Fishkin was involved; he did it very well, and they did this 6,000, people deliberative poll, so 6,000 randomly selected Meta users across the world, across many languages, etc. But it's striking that since that most ambitious one 2 years ago, they've done a much more restricted one this past year, I think, on AI regulation with only 15 participants and a third of the budget, I believe. And none of the recommendations that came out of those mini publics have so far demonstrably made a difference to Meta's policies. So do worry that we are at peak popularity for mini publics, but therefore also at peak risk of participation washing. So if we don't want mini publics to go the way participatory budgeting went, for example, turning into a harmless and mostly an ornamental addendum to the ways through which representative governments try to look more approachable and inclusive, I think we need to do a bunch of things. One, we should make such bodies truly autonomous, because they are currently, that's a fact, governed by a small group of experts and facilitators who, however well-intentioned and happy to share powers, like I was as a member of a governance committee, these experts are still structurally creating a risk of capture of the mini public. And in fact, a governance committee like the one I was on, to me, is a fig leaf for the real power of the organizing institution, our third legislative chamber called the CESE, which is really pulling the strings and shaping a number of decisions. So I think that there's a reflection on the governance of those bodies that need to happen, and we should move more radically in the direction of self-ruling mini publics. Second, we should make such bodies, mini publics, sovereign over a range of issues. So that's empowerment, so that the recommendations do have an impact and that their power actually perhaps amount to a form of legislative power. That's, of course, the most difficult step to achieve. I mean, Simone has mentioned the sort of pushback from the political theory community, but mostly the pushback is from elected officials who have really a hard time accepting the competition that this represents for their own legislative power. And also, I think practically it's very hard because you probably need a constitutional moment to validate and legitimize a political role for mini publics, sort of legislative power for mini publics. The third thing, I think, is connected to the question of mass democracy and mass movements, which is we need to maintain and deploy the connection of mini publics to mass referenda, social movements, deliberation in a larger public sphere, and forms of direct participation. It's absolutely key to the legitimacy of the whole system, as I just argued, but it's also key to the epistemic value of such mini publics, because their representativeness currently is still questionable, because they're too small and participation is often optional, etc. So I think there's hope there, actually. I think it's doable, because we have now also technological tools like AI that allow the connection to the larger public. And also, at least from my observations in the French cases, the citizens who are chosen want that. They're actually desperate to sort of go out of the walls of the mini publics they're in to connect to the larger country, and they do it sometimes against the sort of preferences of the governance committee or the organizing entities. So that's where I stand at the moment, yeah, I'm very delighted to have a chance to share those views and to engage in a conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Hélène. Thank you, Simone, for these opening statements. I think it's I know as I was listening, I was thinking that Simone was perhaps a bit more positive about mini publics than I expected, and Hélène was perhaps tempered her enthusiasm a bit more than I expected. So there's an interesting juxtaposition there. So let me just start with a question for Hélène. Now you said that that the situation we're in with mini publics is perhaps peak popularity and peak risk, and of course you had some suggestions about how to move forward. But you also pointed out that politicians are often quite skeptical and very reluctant to grant real power, real authority to mini publics and their recommendations. But then there's a question of, well, how do we get from here to there if politicians are reluctant to go in the direction which you seek? And I wondered also about citizens. I'm thinking of surveys that have been done recently by my co-author Andre Beitiger and his colleagues, and I think there are some other surveys done as well on citizen perceptions of mini publics and their roles. And it seemed, well, to cut a long story short, it seems that majorities in those surveys do not seem very keen on granting a larger role to mini publics. That they would see them in essentially, maybe in sort of limited terms as a form of consultation. Of course, we see very different results when we look at the people who participated in mini publics. They tend to be much more enthusiastic. Or even, actually, I'm trying to remember Andre's results. I think that even there are sort of limits to the kind of role that the participants want them to play. So, in light of that, who exactly holds the key to expanding the role of mini publics along the lines which you seek, Hélène?
Well, I would say that there's a tactical element of trying to build on the success of current consultative mini publics and trying to make them gain in legitimacy in the eyes of the larger public, such that step by step the politicians have a hard time opposing them or perhaps trying to defend them completely, and then it's a fine line to walk, because you want the buy-in of politicians. I think you can't go anywhere without them. But at the same time, the only way to initially get their buy-in is to say, oh, it's purely consultative and it's complementary. Don't worry, it's not a threat to your power. But the reality is that, to me, it is a competition, and the sort of idea would be to say, look, you need to give away power, but it's going to be good for you. It's going to re-legitimize you. It's going to, so that's, I think, the least threatening way of trying to convince politicians that it's actually a good thing for them, that they are not doing a good job because they have too much on their plate and they are not capable of reaching agreements on a bunch of issues. On some issues, they have no legitimacy, say on even electoral rules or insider trading of a representative or stuff like that. That shouldn't even be, or districting, or it shouldn't be in their hands to begin with. So taking that power away, putting it in the hands of a different body, or perhaps long-term issues that they can't think about sort of structurally because they're focused on the next 5 years. All of that, they should see it as to their benefit, to let go of that power, to refocus on other issues. So I'm not sure about the tactics. And then the conservatism of public opinion, I mean, it's not irrational. I mean, you better stick to the devil than try something new. So I think it's perfectly reasonable on the part of people who don't know enough about that to stick to a purely consultative role. But I think that the point is that once you know more about those bodies, you realize that they have an incredible potential. And so I think little by little, we need to do a work of persuasion. And in fact, the first sort of advocates for that are former members of Citizens' Assemblies, I think. So, and also think that you could rethink the education system, expose young children and students to that sort of autocratic element of democracy, and then they would naturally ease into supporting more power for them.
Can I jump in on that for a second?
Yeah.
So there is other data. So for example, Pew did a huge study of trust in government in 2022. And this was in France, Germany, United States, and England, UK. And the numbers were staggering. How many people supported both the referendum and citizen assemblies? Now, it's not clear how much they knew about citizen assemblies. They weren't asked about empowerment. But the numbers were in all four places, like in the high 70s and low 80% of people said great. And this was in the same poll, people were very down on representatives and elected officials. Okay, so one of the ways of reading those polls is to say this is a kind of populism, right? This is people who have lost faith in elected representatives. You know, they think they want to get out of the swamp. And so there is this potential, and especially seeing as the numbers supporting referendums and citizen assemblies were pretty much the same. So my worry is actually a little bit different. My worry is that real populist leaders are actually going to see this and try to harness this kind of feeling for like nefarious purposes. I mean, it's one thing to have a kind of a general populist feeling on the part of or sentiment on the part of citizens that is really anti-elite, that says, yeah, that sounds great, you know, let's have more referendums. But it can be abused and manipulated. And so my worry is that there is that potential of support for this institution. And it can actually be harnessed by, I think, some very problematic elite. And so I'm hoping that the less problematic elite are going to kind of see the way in which this is something that is very popular. This is something that citizens want, and maybe to be able to structure it in a way that it's not manipulated or used by problematic populists. So I mean, I saw Andre's, you know, data, and I do understand, but I think there's a lot of other data out there that says there's really quite a lot of support on the part of citizens for citizen assemblies.
Actually, that's interesting, Simone, what you say about populists, because another finding of Andre and his colleagues is that they categorize citizens into different types, and they do have populist citizens as one type, and it turns out that support for granting more decision-making power to mini publics is higher amongst populist citizens than other categories of citizens. Yeah. But I think populist leaders have not yet realized that. And maybe
I worry they will.
So maybe if they do, then perhaps your scenario might pass. But Simone, actually, I do have another question for you, because I was expecting you, well, based on what you had said before the seminar in our email exchanges, to say a bit about the idea that many publics might be opinion leaders and mobilizers in partisan debates. Right. And so I wonder if you could just say a bit about how you see the role of mini publics in that light, in terms of how they enter a partisan landscape.
Yeah, well, I have to think about that, but here is actually, I think, a difference between Hélène and myself. So the picture she painted was adversarial between the forces of open democracy, which include referendums, participatory, various types of participatory activities, social movements, citizen assemblies. And then on the other side, you know, recalcitrant elected officials who want to hold on to power. And I'm not saying that that's not right, that they do want to hold on to power, and that they are obstacles and enemies in the kind of fight for democracy. So I do think that there is clearly some self-interest going on elected officials to keep the power structure that brought them to power. But I am interested in ways in which citizen assemblies can somehow integrate themselves into the electoral system, and particularly the public opinion formation. So we have more and more of these really great studies where mostly having to do with referendum, where citizen assemblies their opinions, right? They can be opinion leaders and opinion formers. So then the question is, how can that move into more like, you know, normal elections, the elections of representatives? And I'm not sure, but I think that there are some ways of looking at citizen assemblies, not just as policy consultants, but as participants in public opinion formation that feeds into the electoral process, the electing of representatives. The one way, which is a very small way, but this is actually, there have been some suggestions of using citizen assemblies as ethics oversight boards, right? So this would be using citizen assemblies to identify problematic ethics on the part of individuals, elected officials, or also officials who are trying to be elected, and contributing that to the public sphere. So, we're not going to get rid of elections, and I think that like Hélène, I think that citizen assemblies can be sort of a positive competition for power, but I also think there has to be more integration, and I think that there can be ways. I mean, that's what I'm trying to look at now, ways in which citizen assemblies can participate in the public opinion formation that leads into actually elections, basically, with opinions about representatives.